Welcome to On Trauma and Power. I'm your host, Jenn Turner, co-founder of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. I'm so glad you're here with us. Each episode, I sit down with different experts, educators, authors, survivors, and practitioners, sharing different trauma-informed experiences across various fields. Join us as we explore the complex intersections of trauma and power through embodied healing and diverse perspectives in both our personal and collective healing journeys. Let's dive on in. Hey, Tiffany. So glad you're here. Thank you for joining me for this conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to have conversations with you. I learn so much when we talk. So I'm excited to learn more today. So I'll just introduce you with your bio for folks, and then we can kind of do a little grounding present moment experience, if that sounds good.
Sounds good to me. Yeah.
So Dr. Tiffany Johnson is an associate professor of organizational behavior at Georgia Tech and a researcher focused on work, equity, and wellness. A certified yoga and meditation teacher, she brings trauma-sensitive, stillness-based practices into her work, supporting trauma-informed approaches in academia and guiding retreats for Black and Brown women in academia. I am so excited to talk about all of that. And I'd love to first invite you and everyone else that's with us to maybe do kind of this landing in our body so we can bring our full selves or maybe more of ourselves into the conversation. So you're welcome to start with your eyes open or closed. That's always your choice. And you might take a moment to acknowledge that you're here, that you've arrived, and that this next conversation is time and space for us to explore new ideas, maybe refine ideas that we've talked through before, but also that as we drop into our bodies, it's a chance to kind of notice being in the present moment. And one way to do that could be through movement. So if you'd like, could begin with some side-to-side movement. So that might be with your torso, kind of shifting from one side to the other. And again, as I'm offering movement here, you might decide there's another way you'd like to move or be in your body. So again, there could be some side-to-side movement, maybe forward and back movement. Could also become circular at some point if that feels interesting to you. Possibility to explore movement for your spine and torso. If you are circling, you might move in both directions or move in the opposite direction. You're welcome to stay with that movement, or we could shift here and possibly checking out your shoulders, noticing what's happening with them. Could do some lifting and lowering of your shoulders. You might notice what happens to your jaw when you lift your shoulders. You could also do some circling of your shoulders. You might be exploring that with your arms sort of at your side. You could also bring your hands to your shoulders and circle that way. You might circle one at a time, or you could kind of move them together. Maybe moving in both directions. Again, you're welcome to stay with kind of movement in your shoulders, or one more possibility to kind of invite us into this moment could be to explore movement through your head or neck. One way to do that might be moving your chin from side to side. Again, as you're moving, you might notice that you're breathing. If that's interesting to you, to pay attention to your breath. You could move your head kind of side to side. You might also lift and lower with your chin. You're welcome to move within any pace or any range. And at some point, you might drop your chin. You can hang out here or possibly shift into head circles of some sort. That could be a half circle, a full circle, or anywhere in between. Now, another option as we're moving is you might decide you want to pause somewhere. Maybe there's a feeling or sensation in your neck or your upper back that you'd like to explore or stay with. Or maybe you're exploring continuous movement. And again, you're welcome to stay with this particular movement or any movement you might be exploring. Or whenever you're ready, possibility that we begin to shift out of our internal experience or movement based and maybe shifting back toward one another. But there's no rush in getting there. Right. Great. Thanks for doing that along with me. So, I'd love to kind of jump in and maybe hear a bit from you around what it means to you and how, in any way you want to share it, to kind of bring a trauma-informed perspective into a business school context. And I'm sure that's a big topic, so feel free to dive in however you like.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start answering that question by kind of giving like how I like the history of me kind of being more intentional around bringing trauma slowly but surely into a business school setting.
That sounds great.
Okay, so as a PhD student, I was doing research on job coaches who work with people with autism and related disabilities. And so I talked to job coaches, and I also was interviewing employees who were on the autism spectrum, so autistic employees. And I was in the field. I was at a field site visiting one particular area where it was like a community of autistic employees who kind of supported each other. I went on a walk with a young woman, and she said, was talking to me about my research, and she was like, what you should be looking at as you study kind of our experiences at work. And I was like, what do you think? And she said, you should be looking into trauma. And I said, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that insight with me. I'm really curious about that. When I got back to school, I told the chairs of my dissertation that was a suggestion from a research participant. I added a folder for literature on trauma, and it's kind of started since then. So I just started to like read about and try to connect to teachers around trauma, just try to understand like what it meant and why this particular person was saying like you should be looking at trauma and the intersection of trauma and work, because that's what I study inside the business school. I study, organizational behavior, human resources, the way that organizations and workplaces are run. And so this intersection of trauma and work became like, it just kept coming back to me. And so by the time I started as a faculty member at Georgia Tech, I had kind of, been following that trail, kind of doing some things around taking classes on mindfulness and meditation, started going to this really great yoga studio where I got my YTT certificate from. And my meditation teacher, one of the co-owners of that studio, Meryl Arnett, was also trauma informed. And so she incorporated trauma informed topics in our training. And I was like, I'm really interested in this. I asked her, where else can I go to learn about trauma and like meditation and yoga? And she was like, CFT, and so she led me to you all. And so that really helped me to, when I started taking when I did the CERT program through TCTSY, I had more language, like specific categories of the ways in which trauma shows up. And I started seeing, at that time, I was also reading a lot around like the history of work and like the racialized and like the colonial history of work. And I started seeing where some of the norms on work and behaving in organizations were just inherently traumatic, where one has lost their agency, where there's abuse of power just like embedded into what we consider to be the norm of how we show up at work. And this is what I'm teaching. Like, I'm teaching a lot of students around org behavior and human resources. This is how you run and this is how you manage human resources. And if you slow down and break down those words in and of itself, it kind of gives you a hint to the ways in which we are socialized to believe that we should show up in organizations. We are resources. We are resources to be managed. And so as I was learning, I could not teach the same way. I just couldn't. I couldn't go into class and talk about like performance is this. And to be a high performer, you do like performance is one of the main like outcomes that we're interested in org behavior. It's like the second chapter. What does performance mean? What does it mean to be a good performer, a high performer at work? Couldn't do it. And then in human resources, it's like, what do we mean by human? I just couldn't do it. So I would, I teach the stuff in the book, and then I offer, a critical or an alternative lens to that, and then invite students and myself into reimagining what if, we kind of look through the lens of trauma at how we work. How might we want to show up differently in the workplace when we do that? So that's really kind of how I started and what I did. I just started bringing these questions little by little about like trauma and into my classes around org behavior and human resources. And then I created a class called Work, Equity, and Wellness, where trauma kind of takes more of a center stage because we look at the history of work, like the racialized history of work. And we are very specific about pointing out the ways in which what we are used to, the culture that we're used to, the work culture that we're used to has so many elements of trauma in it. And we don't stop there, though. We start to reimagine how we might do the work of equity in a way that is not perpetuating, at least as much as possible, trauma. We're not trying to be perfect at it, but we're trying to just be more aware and self-aware of the ways in which we've all been kind of just, drinking in this ocean, like swimming in this ocean that we didn't even realize that we were in.
Yeah. Can you talk about that more? I find that so interesting in terms of like pulling out the ways in which we have been socialized and taught to be workers and to be resources. And, and the we is of course not a monolith, like all the different, some of the layers that you might unpack too with your students around how that shows up in a racialized way, in a gender-based way, or, anything you want to share.
Yeah. So for like everyone, we talk about like performance, and I'll just ask often students, what do you think makes somebody a high performer? What makes somebody a good worker? And oftentimes what comes is they can multitask. They're very efficient. They're fast. They respond. Da, 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 da. And underneath those responses are some assumptions about how we're supposed to act in organizations, meaning we're supposed to basically grind. We are supposed to act like a machine. Our bodies are supposed to be ignored. And that's across all race and ethnic groups, right? That is the history of of our work culture in this country. Everybody has been socialized into that. And so then we start thinking, so then they're like, oh, wow, like that's interesting. Though there's this really great book, I have to say, that I was introduced to by Dr. Stella Nkomo, who is a management professor in South Africa. She highly suggested this book to a group of us. It's called The Production of Difference. And that is the book where we really start to kind of piece apart like how racialized and ethnic differences started to play a role in what we now know as work as well, and how actually like our work culture and our work norms in this country help to create racial hierarchies. So although everybody has been kind of socialized about like some of these assumptions about like just ignore your body, and right now the goal is to be a very efficient resource to get what we need done so we can make profit, right? So we can make profit and turn it around. And that is driven by the reliance on free and exploited labor. And a lot of the norms around how to get to that use of human resources at a minimal cost to enhance or to bolster revenue and capital generation comes from colonization and plantation slavery. These are the ways to really be able to exploit human resources, if you will, for capitalistic purposes. And so when in their book, they basically, in the book, The Production of Difference, what they do is they just literally just show us archives from like periodicals and newspapers from like the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And I think it goes back that far. I might be wrong. But several centuries. And they show us how people were talking about how to manage laborers, how to do it well. Like they were the ones who were created. Like, here's how you manage the enslaved in this way. Here's how you manage the enslaved African. Here's how you manage the Native American. Here's how you manage the person from Mexico. Here's how you manage the person from China, right? And they all have different rules around how to be managed. They say these people, so they would say, if an enslaved African runs away, that just means that they're sick and they're lazy and they've lost their mind, right? So what's best for them is to bring them back. If they like get tired, then they're sick. Just give them more work. What's best for them is to work all day, every day. And there were medical doctors co-signing on this, applying like labels. Wow. And saying, yes, they are sick. And then the medicine for that is to work. And so you can see how, although that feels very extreme and like, just like, what? That sounds wild. You start to see how over centuries and over generations, how those ideas and those expectations for racialized bodies to overwork and to even to go to like grind even more, to just move a little bit of an inch along in the workplace, is continue to be expected and continue to be internalized.
And that someone is sick if they are leaving captivity.
Yeah, they're sick if they're trying to liberate themselves.
Right. And so then there's a reason to double down on it. They just
they're sick. And if you put that in like the language of trauma, they're sick if they realize their agency. They're sick if they're trying to act upon their agency, which we know that is a very poignant example of an abuse of power and trying to make sure people do not have and do not enact the sense of agency. And while that seems like worlds away, we can still start to see some of those norms perpetuated in more implicit but really profound ways if we look at some of the like health inequities among Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, non-binary people in workplaces, and like the like weathering effects of having to prove ourselves in ways that are not consistent with our peers from other identity groups.
Like an inherent belief around laziness or around, working, or that is like in the water. That's powerful. That's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about deconstructing some of these, ways of being and colonial perspectives and ways of working and setting up a workspace, how do you even start that? Or what are some of the things that you invite your students to lean on?
Yeah, so in class, we lean on our imagination a lot, which means we have to really come back to ourselves and come back to our body. We have to come back to interoception in the language of the TCTSY framework, CFTE's, model. We need to come back towards the understanding what it is we need, because in the class that I teach, because I'm like, we have to like bring it in and like figure out like what's in our control. what I often talk about in that class and what we're often working on is how do we do the work of, trying to be change makers, trying to do good in the world, trying to be do-gooders, trying to change, make things more sustainable, more equitable, without giving into the unsustainable practices and wave of grind culture of these like really colonial ways of working. So how do we do the work that's important to us without approaching work in the same way? All right. And so we start to really, it seems really, really small, but we start to come back into our bodies. So we do rest practices in class, reflections in class, and then start to like imagine and like use models of different organizations that are trying to do things in a different way. So we'll talk about people like Trisha Hershey from the NAP ministry. We'll lean on examples from like Octavia Rahim, who does a lot, and Dr. Gail Parker, right, who does a lot on, race-based stress and like some of the things that they talk about like restoration and about rest and some of those practices. And we'll pair them with what will this look like in the workplace? It might look like if we're talking about slowing down, it might look like an agenda being more spacious, right? Kind of like what we did at the beginning of our call, right? Something like that. It might look like changing the structure for human resources or for the people department, changing the structure of PTO. It might look like looking at leave policies for people in those departments, like in like the people HR departments. For managers, supervisors, it might look like creating project management timelines that are also more spacious, offering more flexibility in terms of where people work and how they work. Not emailing people after, asking people when are their work hours. And because some people do like to work late, some people like to work early in the morning, but really just making sure people feel like it's really, really, it's like, we're not just saying it, but it's really okay if you take a couple days to respond to the email. It's okay. And I know that there are some industries where like it seems more pressing if you think about like the medical industry or, emergency room. But we also know that those folks need even more ability and more opportunity to be able to rest. That when they don't rest, they make even bigger mistakes, which are life-threatening.
Larger consequences to that or more.
Larger for that. Pilots, medical, surgeons, emergency room doctors, nurses, even though their structures are very much so one, oftentimes in their training there are structures that are depriving them and depriving their bodies of their rest. It doesn't really help them to be not only effective in like some of the more like practical kind of evident like body, like things to heal the body, but also their bedside manner their like ability to be compassionate is minimized.
Think about first responders, right? We have people that are really, kind of forced to burn the candle at both ends, the hours they keep and have so much kind of power in their role in our society.
Exactly.
Well, and you were kind of starting to tap into my next curiosity, which was how do you get buy-in? Because it's like, yeah, I mean, as a person who works in the world, that sounds great to have more spacious PTO rules or require, have more time, prioritize rest. But do you all talk about, how do you get buy-in from people that are in positions of power? And like, what is the rationale?
Mm-hmm. We talk about what it means to make an influence in an organization. And we also talk about everybody takes on a different role. So some of us are going to be the people that are the ones who have to get buy-in for this. Some of us, that's not our strong point, and that's not what we need.
Mm-hmm. Fair.
I probably shouldn't be the one in the room trying to get buy-in for that. I'm going to tap you in for that. Right? So first we talk about like knowing what role you play in effectuating this kind of change, but also there's a framework in our field. Now the name is going to escape me, but essentially the idea is to take small steps towards the organization changing in this way, like to really slow down and even trying to make sure the whole organization changes, and to really start to like work within your circle of influence. So whoever is next to you, if it could be a colleague, somebody who doesn't have formal power, and really it starts with yourself. So if you want the organization to make these big shifts, how are you going to make those shifts in your own life? And start with that first. And then maybe some coworkers might start noticing, or it'll come up like, something's different. Like I noticed this, I noticed that, I noticed that you did this, I noticed you didn't respond to the email. And then it gives you an opportunity to genuinely bring it up. And it also allows you to model the behavior, to be the change that you're hoping that you want the whole organization to see, versus just talking about it, right? And over time, you start to impact other people. And one of those people in your circle of influence will be a good person to help get buy-in. It may not be you, but one of those people will be. And you start building coalitions in that way.
Love that.
Yeah, it may not happen I always tell my students that this change may not happen in your lifetime, but you will be a part of the change. Right? You will play a very significant role in effectuating the change. And most importantly, you will have helped to create a more restful and a life that's at the pace that you want it to be in for yourself. And outside of the workplace, that will impact your friends and your family members as well. Your life will be impacted by it. And that's, I think, in that class, that's where we start. And that's where we end. Yeah.
That's powerful. It's so powerful. And I'm thinking as you're talking that, I'm thinking about some of the embodied organizational work that we're doing together as well. And how one of the things I really learned from you are the structures that are in place to, often without our awareness, to keep us, and you mentioned this already, disconnected from our bodies, and actually being rewarded for being disconnected from not listening when we're sick, not resting, not using the restroom, not pausing to eat and like digest. It's like eating while working or whatever, or not eating. And, as we started the kind of our beginning today, I was thinking about how when we stop and pay attention to our body, we can also learn information that we may not want to know. It's like, oh my God, I'm so freaking tired right now. Or like, my back hurts so bad, I don't know if I can finish this day. When we're disconnected, then the system will reward us at times if we're in that kind of system that is, hyper-capitalist and hyper-productivity focused.
Yeah, oftentimes they do. I grew up in nonprofit organizations, and that's where my first kind of like, whoa, these organizations are extremely like both my parents worked in them. People are like, because we care so much about the mission, but we are like the people who get like promotions and get who are getting, raises and who are moving up the nonprofit ladder were people who were sacrificing their bodies at the altar of organization. All right. But it wasn't framed in that way. We didn't know that was what was happening, but it wasn't intentional. I think that's one of the key takeaways the key things I like to remind myself and my students, like none of us were taught, like we're given these connections. So we really, I really have to be gentle with myself as well. And we need to be gentle with each other because we inherited this way of being. And people weren't doing, like, I believe that the people that my parents and were working with were not doing that intentionally. That is literally what they all learned was the right way to approach their work. And we just didn't know. Right. But now, once we get this awareness, can we change the incentives and even just the language in our organizations, like you said, like to not incentivize the people who are always available. That's one of the examples I like to give, because I'm like, I've seen it in so many organizations, no matter what kind of industry, where it's like the people who get acknowledged and get like, loved on and like so many taps on the back and all this, like they're always available. It doesn't matter what they pick up and they do, and they're praised. But we know that organizational cultures are in part created, like the behavior that becomes a norm in a culture, created in part by who is awarded and what behaviors are awarded. So when that happens, what's everybody going to start doing? Especially if they are extrinsically motivated by those kinds of awards. They're going to start doing the same thing.
So true. As you've been talking, I was thinking about this one particular person I used to work with who is very much the same. I mean, she was like harming herself truly to just continue to work and be available and take shifts that she didn't want to take ultimately, but felt like she should or was supposed to in service of the greater good. And, of course, there are moments that we want to find a way to be in community and support one another, but not at our own expense. And I think that's the message, right?
Yeah.
It's like, when I think about the early seedlings of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, when Dave and I were doing this work, a lot of it in the beginning was unpaid because we felt like it had to be because there wasn't money to do it. And we cared about this. And as we started churning along, it was like, oh, we need to be really careful to not create a culture where there's an expectation that people are going to work for free. Yeah. It's like that may have been a choice we made because we were both very indoctrinated in this kind of thing around belief. Like if you believe in it and you get the warm fuzzies, like that's all you need. Actually, you need groceries and you need a home and, clothing and other things that you need money for. So, but there's this like somehow there's so much morality around it, I think that.
Yes. And I think that's why I think like social enterprise, like do good types of initiatives and organizations really have a special place in my heart around this messaging and around this work, because I know how the people who do that work really do care about the mission, very mission driven. And when we're mission driven, it's really easy to like go all in on whatever that mission is outside of us and to at the expense of what we need and what we desire. And before we know it, then, though, our body is starting to break down and we are no longer a vehicle for the mission because we are no longer capable of participating in it. Right. And so but I get it because I have been there and I have seen people who have been there and I still do it sometimes. It is really like intoxicating, It's really intoxicating. Like the passion for whatever mission, we have, it can really just be, I get like the flow and it can be all consuming. And so the question and the curiosity becomes, how do I not let it go, but how do I do this and take care of myself? And how do I do this and tap into what my body is needing as I do this work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. How can it be sustainable? And there's so much turnover and burnout, particularly in the nonprofit world, because of just that, and I don't know if this is too hard of a pivot, but I'm wondering, I'm thinking also about, as we're talking about workplace, reimagining academic institutions and the kind of culture there, which is no small thing to tackle, but I know it's something that you contemplate and, so curious about how some of these aspects of power, colonization show up in academic institutions, or how you're kind of paving your own way.
Yeah. I don't think that's a hard pivot at all. I think that makes, because I was actually thinking about when we were talking about like the nonprofits and like, the ways in which that has shown up for me and being so like mission driven, where I will kind of forget my body inside of academia, because, I want the students that I work with to get everything that they come here for. I come from a lineage of two grandfathers who were not afforded the opportunity to make it past elementary school. So when it comes to educating people and to having that as part of my job, I take it very seriously, and I don't need crumbs, right? I ain't trying to leave no crumbs. Right. and so it's really that for me is very intoxicating. That is my intoxication. Like I the students, what about what they need? And so it's really easy to be, and then like the service to the school, I want the school to succeed. I want the school to be able to continue to serve, Before I know it, I'm working like 70 hours a week. Like it's just, and it can go out of hand. And so I think my experience has been in academia, I have experienced several bouts of, burnout, or like hitting a wall, where in such a way that my body, like, I don't even realize it because I'm so in go mode that my body starts to give signals like hair loss and things like that. And people, you don't have any hair loss? And I'm like, and I open up my hair and there's like a, big bald spot. And they're like, oh, it's your stress. I'm like, I'm not stressed. I'm good. And you're like, are you
Body's saying something else, my dear.
saying something else? And that didn't really happen to me until I started graduate school. And then I hit another wall when I started my first this faculty position here at Georgia Tech. And so I feel like I was forced to try to find another way of existing inside of academia. And that for me was like, the restorative practices, and really kind of like learning from those practices and engaging in those practices and engaging in communities that practice those things so that I could come back into my body and, pay attention to what my own needs and desires were. And then doing that also, I feel, kind of filled up a well of courage. I don't know if there's research from you all's work that looks at like interoception. Some of your work in like courage, but I think that there's some kind of connection. That's my hypothesis. I don't know.
I'm going to talk to Dr. Vianne about that one.
Yeah, talk to Dr. Vianne about that one. Study.
Maybe
Exactly.
we'll collaborate on a little something. That's
Yes.
great.
Yes. I really do feel like there was, as I did that, the more like my throat chakra was like ding, 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 ding. And it was like I was willing to express in different ways, in very relational ways, right? Like, this is what I need. And I was willing to be courageous to say, like, even though you want this, this is what I'm able to do. I was willing to negotiate things a little bit more about what, based on what this person wants, but what I'm willing to do, what my students wanted, and be able to draw those boundaries. And it took a lot. I'm still in the process of it, but I think that is the way in which I started to turn and start doing things, start showing up differently in academia. And it has literally, like, I was in a point where I was literally considering not staying in academia because I did not know how to exist in those waters and to like sustain myself. And still I started to, thank God, gain access to some of these resources and some of these practices. And now I'm so glad that I'm still in academia, but that I'm not doing it in the same way. I like to say I'm in academia, but I'm not of academia.
I love that.
It's not like I don't have to do it the same way that it's shaped, because academia it's beautiful in many ways. It's where people learn and where people grow. And we also know from research, it's also where, racialized and gender-based hierarchies and social class-based hierarchies are cemented. That's where people really learn what, how to differentiate based on, race, gender, class, because we're teaching things that came from plantation slavery and colonialism.
Yep.
Especially in business school. That's where you're learning about all of these things. And so it only helps to fine tune the spirit of racism, the spirit of inequity, the spirit of, those like energies are sometimes fine tuned in some classrooms, not all, because there are other classes that don't. But now we're starting to see more people inside the business school and outside talking about how we can, reimagine a different way of talking about business and organization. So I'm really hopeful about that.
Well, and what you said too is that you're describing how it also came from the inside out when you sort of had your own reckoning with what it's like in your body, and then how that supported you in showing up differently and using your voice. And
yeah, that is why I feel like I'm so convicted and to teach the way that I do, because I am my own data point. I have that is my experience. Before that, I wanted everything to change around me. And I remember going to one of my teachers, now friends and colleagues, who's a yoga. She's got her PhD in decolonial psychology as well. And she does a lot around creativity and imagination, Dr. Shanti Cacarante Perez. I remember telling her, because we were both in academia, and I'm like, this is so, like, it needs to change. Like, this is whack, da, 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 da. And she's like, she looked me like straight in the eye and she was like, you need to change. You need to be the change. You're the change. Not all that. It's you. And I was like, oh, dang. She just gathered me very lovingly.
Gathered me. I love that.
She was right.
That's beautiful. And it also, reminds me too, when at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, we've had people, and you've been one of them, who've come and given us input and feedback about how we want to create a workplace. What are some of the norms we have now? How do we want to do things differently? Initially, I was waiting for, and especially when we started doing this work with our colleague Sadada Jackson, I was waiting for her to come and say, like, here's how you fix the shit that's wrong. And she was like making us turn inward. And I was like, what are we doing here? And then it took me some time to realize she's not going to come in and tell us the way that we are replicating these patterns of racism, inequity, power dynamics, hierarchical power dynamics. And we have to discover it for ourselves, because we're just going to keep perpetuating it otherwise.
That's right. That is one of the legacies of colonialism is to kind of seek knowledge outside of you versus knowing that there's wisdom that is like just waiting inside of you to be tapped into. Like, so much, yes, we still need to learn, and there are so many answers that like are just waiting for us to like tap into, like that's really inside of us. It have to come from us. It's not always the external stuff that's going to be telling us what to do. But colonial legacy would say that's how you run. Like, that's how you do stuff, is you look to the master. You look to the person who knows more. They're the one, and they literally, direct the ship. They're the ones, and you just fall in line and do it. Whereas, indigenous wisdom would tell us, like, there's so much intuition that we have in our own bodies and in our own lineage, that if we slow down enough to let that kind of, come back for us to remember, it's a really process of like remembering, just remembering and remembering and remembering, though a lot of the answers are going to come back out. And when they come out from an embodied place, that's one of the best ways to implement them for the rest of the team or the organization. People will model what they like, the behavior that they see. People respect integrity when what you say and what you do are in line. And so it creates a strong ripple, even though it might seem really small and it takes time. Once it starts to pop off, there's no way it can impact the surroundings that we're in.
Resonating so deeply with that. And it's interesting to think, I've often thought about this through the lens of healing and like therapy and therapeutic interventions. But of course, in academic institutions as well, right? We get this idea that someone's going to disseminate the information to us and we will receive it. And it's very passive, as opposed to this like proactive self-discovery, transformational experience.
Ooh, and listen, that's what I have to tell the students in my class, the class that I created, Work, Equity, and Wellness. The first syllabus week is that I have to be like, if you're looking for me to tell you the answers, you are probably in the wrong class. Because we are literally trying to model a different way of being. Like, I'm trying to do it as we're in the class. So the way I create my syllabus, the way that we like work together in class, the student teacher dynamic, the power relationship that we're used to inside the classroom, who has the wisdom and who doesn't, who's the sage on the stage and who isn't, all of that, we have to like start to relax that a little bit. It's hard for me. It is hard for me because I grew up in academia. I got really used to that power difference and that power differential. And it's very enticing to be on the other side of it and be able to be the person who gets to control and be in power. So it's hard for me too, but I am always like, I'm not going to give you all the answers. I'm going to ask you to really like sit with stuff and let the answers come up. And it's hard for us to do that. It's hard for me to do it. It's hard. And we all struggle every semester. There's a point where we're just like, I'm struggling. Everybody in the class is struggling because oftentimes the students will come in and say, like, I want the answers. I want to solve DEI stuff like right now. Like, give me, I came here to tell me the answers. And by week 3, they're like, I still don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm like, exactly.
Perfect. But no one wants to hear it, right? Yeah.
Like, but then I get really uncomfortable because I'm like, am I not doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And I start to question myself. And then because it's such a strong current, that's the thing. And it's such a strong current. I battle with it, every single time I teach that class. I'm struggling because I know it's different for all of us, including me,
But how powerful your students can be when the knowledge then they carry the knowledge with them in a different kind of way than if you hand something to them that you can't really hand to anyone.
It's kind of like the practice that you guided us in the beginning when you were offering the possibilities but you said you kind of gave us choices of which one we did. And it's like, oh, I didn't think of it. Let me see I didn't even know there was something over here that's tight. Let me play around with that. Like, that's it was just as you were doing that, guiding that practice, I'm like, that is exactly what we're talking. That is an embodied what we're trying to do is like, we can guide, we can offer possibilities and choices. And once more people are guided in that kind of way, the more that they practice and experiment with their own agency, who knows what's possible when that starts to happen. You just start to realize so much about and learn so much about yourself and about your surroundings when you're invited into this language in this world of possibility. And you kept saying it's possible. Here's one possibility here. I'm like, oh, this is really empowering. This is like really helping me right now. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to do.
Gosh, I love these conversations with you. I'm so grateful to know you and have you join us here and to work with you. I mean, I could just keep riffing, but I want to honor your time and appreciate it. So we will provide some links for folks, so that they can learn more about your work. Anything else we didn't get to that you wanted to name here or?
No, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to chat and learn. I feel like, sometimes when you get with certain people, they're in groups, there's like a synergy, or there's an energy, like there's this co-creation. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to co-create and just share.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Me too. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. To find out more about today's guest, head to healwithcfte.org/podcast. Follow us on Instagram @OnTraumaAndPower to stay up to date on future episodes. And be sure to like and subscribe to On Trauma and Power wherever you listen to your podcast. We'll see you next time. Take care.